our greatest national security threat right now is really an insider threat. And it's backed up by a new acceptance that if you don't like the outcome of an election, violence is then in some way warranted.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and in this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the key national security threats facing the United States. It was in mid-October that the Biden administration released its long-awaited national security strategy, a 45-page document that evaluates a wide range of threats and challenges both foreign and domestic. To break those threats down for you and to talk about what we may be missing, I'm joined by New York Times national security correspondent, David Sanger. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from Visa. The pandemic has dealt the world an almost generational setback in ending global inequality. But there are ways for technology to help get things back on track. Visa and GZERO Media have partnered to explore the ways in which digital tools can help close the global equality gap. Visit gzeromedia.com/closing the gap to learn about the crucial role remittances, digital trade, and the shift away from cash payments can play in empowering underserved groups to participate in the global economy.
David Sanger, welcome to GZERO World.
Thanks so much, Ian. Great to be back with you.
So I want to start a pretty big picture. A mutual friend of ours, former Defense Secretary Ash Carter, just passed away a week ago, and I've been thinking about his quote a lot. I think it was exactly, I always tell people the day when nuclear weapons are in the newspaper, we're in real trouble. Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that nuclear weapons are in the newspapers right now, given all of the saber-rattling we've seen from the Kremlin and particularly from President Putin. How much are you worried about nuclear war right now?
Well, Ian, first, a moment about our friend Ash. I had lunch with him on the Monday that he passed away. And we were up at Harvard, and he was full of life and humor and wonderful questions. We were with a number of Harvard faculty and a member of the Biden administration who was up visiting in Cambridge. And we talked about this a little bit. We talked about it in two contexts. One, Putin's threats, and second, China's buildup. And to think about this right, I think you have to sort of separate out two or three different issues. The first is that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I think the fear of use of a nuclear weapon was pretty low. I would say well under 1%. Because at the time, we thought that the Ukrainians would not be much of a match for the Russian military. We've now discovered we had that completely wrong, and that the Ukrainians were quite a match. And at this point, Putin really only has the choice of using some of his extraordinary weapons if he is going to try to fulfill a larger victory, if you could call that a victory.
And again, it's not just Ukraine, of course. It turns out that Ukraine plus NATO support is very much a match.
That's right. Without the NATO support, I don't think the Ukrainians would have held on. With the NATO support, they're doing quite well. I don't think they've got the capacity to win right now, but I don't think the Russians do either in the current standoff, which creates, Ian, what in the Pentagon they call the Ukraine paradox. And the Ukraine paradox is that the more successful the Ukrainians are, the more likely it is that Putin will consider using cyber, chemical, biological, or nuclear. Now, those are all very different. right? And I don't think that chemical or biological is terribly useful in this conflict at all. And chemical doesn't spread out very far. He can do more damage with his conventional missiles. Biological is very hard to control, and he's right near the Russian border. Cyber he has used extensively in Ukraine, but has not used outside against the NATO forces. We haven't seen it in the banking system yet. I mean, we've seen sort of the usual background level of Russian activity.
Now, we've seen these airport hits across Europe that some have attributed to Russian sources over the last couple of months. You don't include that.
Well, we've also seen here a fair bit of activity against the usual ransomware suspects, cities, school districts, so forth. Hard to tell how much of this is just the traditional criminal activity and how much of it is something related to the war. But I think it is fair to say that Putin has been pretty cautious not to go over the boundaries of Ukraine. He could have struck physically the incoming weapons flow from NATO out of Poland and Romania. He has not. He could have gone after Bank of America and Citigroup and others in retaliation for the devastating economic sanctions on and export controls on Russia. He has not. And similarly in cyber, we have not seen a big uptick. Now, one explanation for that could be that cyber attacks take a long time to make work. And, SolarWinds, the most successful and ingenious supply chain attack that the Russians ever did on the United States, which happened just at the end of the Trump administration, took 14 or 15 months to put together. So that takes us back to your question and to Ash's quote, which is when nuclear weapons are suddenly in the headlines again, you have to be worried. And I do think we have to be worried because the people inside the U.S. government who I speak to, while they still think the chances of use are remote, they think they are far greater than they were when the war began in late February.
Yeah, the numbers that I hear are more like, they're horrifying numbers. They're more like 20% than they are like 1, which you mentioned before. Is that what you're hearing?
I'm hearing sort of in the 10% region, but I've also heard people with numbers higher than 20%. I'm not sure it's terribly useful to put percentages on this because it factors in 2 or 3 different things. First is how desperate Putin is. Second, what he thinks the price is that he would pay. But thirdly, what kind of nuclear event are we talking about? A week or two ago, you were hearing a lot about dirty bombs. Those are not nuclear weapons. Those are, a stick of dynamite or essentially TNT wrapped in radiological waste. They could make.
But we were hearing about that from the Kremlin, not from the White House, to be clear.
That's right. We were hearing about the Kremlin saying that the Ukrainians were preparing a dirty bomb attack. And we heard the Ukrainians say that the Russians were building dirty bombs in the Zaporizhia nuclear complex. We have not heard any evidence from the U.S. That's not a nuclear weapon. What the Pentagon has been looking at, what the intelligence agencies have been looking at, are the use of small tactical weapons, which could still do a huge amount of damage. Tactical weapons range from sub-kiloton to much larger than what the U.S. used at Hiroshima. Just to scale this conversation, the Hiroshima bomb was a 15-kiloton bomb. And the issue is, if the Russians went to use one, would they use it first in sort of a demonstration over the Black Sea? If they did that, Ian, it's hard for me to understand exactly how NATO or the United States or the Ukrainians would respond, because there are nuclear tests that the North Koreans do. We don't respond to those in a similar way. They could hit a Ukrainian base, a military target. They could hit a civilian location. They could use a small weapon. They could use a larger one. The larger they use, the bigger the chance that the radiation cloud flows back, given the prevailing winds on Russia itself. So there are a lot of considerations. And I think the big debate inside the administration right now is, do you respond militarily? Do you respond just with economic sanctions? Do you try to use this to separate Russia from China and India, everyone else who's buying their oil right now?
So what I am hearing, both from you as well as from the policy leaders, is that nuclear war, which has been for most of my life unthinkable, is now something that policy leaders are actively thinking about.
That's right. In the 60s, Herman Kahn, who was one of the first great sort of nuclear theoretical types, wrote a book.
Was his book on thermonuclear war? Was that the name of the book?
I think he wrote a book called Thinking About the Unthinkable.
Yeah.
And we're suddenly thinking the unthinkable again. And part of the risk here is, and this has always been the risk about tactical nuclear weapons, unlike the big strategic weapons that could fly intercontinentally and which are under control of treaties, in this case, the New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia. The tactical weapons, of which the Russians have about 2,000, have no restrictions. We don't know very much about them. We don't inspect them. We don't know whether they are small, medium, or large. We don't really know their effects. And the chances that we would see them being prepared are only sort of 50-50. We might hear the chatter of military operations getting ready to move them, but it's not clear at all that we would actually see them being moved. So the warning would be pretty low.
The difference, as I see it, the principal difference between what we seem to be moving towards today and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both sides recognized the level of danger and decided to step away from the precipice, is that you were able to achieve the status quo ante relatively quickly. In other words, the impact on the Americans and the Soviets going forward was kind of very similar to what they had before. Where this time around, it's almost inconceivable to imagine that you could create something stable given the realities of the war that the West and Russia are presently in, given the corner that President Putin has managed to dig himself into, facilitated very much, of course, by NATO.
I think that's right, Ian. First of all, it is worth thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis because it was the closest that the world came during the Cold War to a massive calamity that would have killed millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. But the dynamics of it, as you rightly point out, were completely different. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, mutually assured destruction, MAD, did apply, right? If we went up the escalation ladder, we knew that if New York was struck, they'd lose Moscow. They knew it too, and that was a constraining factor. Here, we don't quite have that. Ukraine is not a NATO member. An attack on Ukraine would not necessarily result in a response, and probably not a nuclear response. In fact, the debate I'm hearing in the administration is, do you do a conventional military response or not? The argument against it is that it would quickly escalate or could quickly escalate into a nuclear confrontation. And of course, one of the things you've heard from President Biden is that among his strategic objectives here are a strong, independent, democratic Ukraine and no confrontation directly between the United States and Russia, and certainly no World War III. So the dynamic here is different, and I think the instability that you refer to comes from the fear that if the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon in a conventional war and essentially get away with it, in other words, that they pay a price, but not too big a price, then all of a sudden the taboo about using nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict is gone. We have not seen nuclear weapons used in anger since the United States dropped weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And if that goes away and suddenly smaller nuclear weapons become a weapon of choice in a conventional conflict, we're in a whole different world.
One thing that I've heard some of the Washington policy types discussing as well is that Putin's perspective is not that just you break a taboo using a nuclear weapon, but also that when the Americans used nuclear weapons, it was to end the war definitively because of the escalatory ladder, and that Putin may well be thinking about his nuclear weapons in a similar way, that the West is happy to provide enormous amounts of support to Ukraine because the Russians have been reluctant to truly use their source of power, and that this time around might very well be different. Again, very hard to get into the headspace of someone that we presently consider to be a war criminal, but given the stakes at play, I'm kind of intrigued in asking you your view there.
So as you say, understanding what it is that Putin is thinking at any given moment, requires far greater insight than I have. And I think that most Americans have, because, the one great mystery is what's his turning point, his breaking point. But here's what we do know. We do know that at the beginning of the war, the United States was very hesitant to send certain kinds of weapons for fear that they would cross a red line for the Russians. You didn't see the HIMARS precision artillery sent at the beginning of the war. And in fact, I don't believe that President Biden would have done that for fear of the reaction that Putin would have. Over time, what we've seen is a gradual escalation by NATO and by the United States as they have discovered that they can send greater precision weapons without getting a big reaction out of the Russians. And the question is, where is that new red line? Where's the break point where Putin will say, this goes too far, I'm going to stop this flow of weapons by detonating a nuclear weapon, either a demonstration shot or a shot against Ukrainian military. And that's the big guessing game right now. And that is basically that nuclear paradox I referred to.
Well, let's hope we don't find out, David. But I want to move on because you talk about global security issues, and there are many of them. The other big one driving a lot of concerns, both of mine, of yours, and the headlines, of course, China. And I'm not going to ask you directly a Taiwan question. I want to ask you a semiconductor question, because over the last few weeks, we've seen the United States changing the status quo of the relationship in a pretty significant way through comprehensive and strategic export controls that are meant to contain China's ability to develop a core component of its advanced technology. How surprised are you, that the Americans are engaging in that policy? And what are the implications for the security balance between the two countries?
So I was not surprised that they did it. I was actually surprised it's taken the United States so long to do this. One of the curious features of the competition with China has been that while the Chinese have made huge advances in many different arenas, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the biosciences, and so forth, one area where they have been continually frustrated has been the ability to make the smallest diameter chips, the kinds that we get from Taiwan Semiconductor, and we'll get back to that, and that the Chinese get from Taiwan Semiconductor as well. We're talking about chips that have dimensions that are narrower than 7 nanometers. And that has been a barrier that the Chinese have not been able to break. To get to those dimensions, we are highly dependent on some semiconductor equipment that is made by a company that's in the Netherlands. And when you go into a big chip manufacturing company, you frequently see these $100 million machines sitting right in the middle of a clean room. And it's those machines that the U.S. is going out of its way to make sure that the Chinese cannot get access to. And that's going to be a big task because there are older versions of them. They are out to steal the technology, to replicate the technology, to develop the technology themselves. The U.S. effort right now is sort of fingers in the dike. In other words, it is an effort to try to make sure that the Chinese have years more delay. But sooner or later, China is going to figure this out. And the question is, along the way, do we make them convinced that the U.S. is so out to contain Chinese technological power that they begin to make moves in other areas, including military arenas? And that's critically related to Taiwan, because right now, in my view, Ian, the greatest defense we have against Taiwan being invaded is the existence of Taiwan Semiconductor. China cannot afford to see it destroyed.
Right. So, but that also raises a question of American vulnerability. I mean, if TSMC is not just critical to Chinese semiconductors, but also American semiconductors, not like the U.S. is making these things at home, how do the Americans relate to the fact that one of its most important national security assets happens to be sitting 100 miles away from mainland China?
You know, if there was ever a reason for sort of a commission on American vulnerabilities, one of the first things I would put on their agenda, Ian, would be a study of how we allowed the manufacturing of key semiconductors, not the commodity semiconductors that go into your car or your microwave or whatever, but the real leading edge semiconductors, which the U.S. invented, dominated the technology, and then came to the conclusion in the era of globalization that the supply chain around the world was reliable enough that it didn't make any difference where we manufactured them. And, you know, this was a feature of the past 2 decades. The Europeans did it with oil and gas, being dependent on the Russians. We did it in the semiconductor arena, where we were dependent on Taiwan, but many other places. And the vulnerability of Taiwan was never really considered to be a high-end concern until the past few years. And that's remarkable to me.
I mean, I want to tease this point out more explicitly, because there's been so much criticism in the United States of the proactive decisions of people like German Chancellor Angela Merkel that they were going to allow core aspects of their national security to be energy infrastructure, reliant on Russia. And the United States, essentially, in ways that are probably much more important, ultimately, to U.S. national security, because at least, I mean, gas and oil, you can buy those commodities anywhere. These semiconductors, you can only buy in Taiwan. I mean, who was asleep at the switch in the United States that allowed that kind of vulnerability in a territory that is, frankly, completely contested between the Americans and the Chinese going forward?
Well, who was asleep at the switch? The semiconductor industry in and of itself, a government, a series of governments in the U.S. that knew this was an important technology, but basically just allowed the capitalist flow of supply chain to work its own way. And so if you're looking for political leaders to blame for this, I'd start with George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. And Biden has actually, you know, sort of paid attention to the alarm. Others raised it as an issue. But when you think back to, say, the Trump administration, they worried about China installing 5G communications in the U.S. and NATO nations, a perfectly legitimate concern, but didn't really do very much in the semiconductor area. They recognized it, they talked about it, they didn't do much. Here's the challenge right now. You can buy yourself some time by trying to prevent the Chinese from buying these high-end manufacturing machines and the lithography all around it. But that only works if you then turn around and build enough capacity back in the United States. And that's why you've seen the president show up in Poughkeepsie, New York. The other day, he was at a Micron technology facility in upstate New York. You've seen him in Silicon Valley promoting all of this. But the fact of the matter is that while Taiwan Semiconductor is building in the Southwest and Samsung is building in the Southwest, when those facilities are open, it will address under 5% of the problem.
So TSMC is a private sector company with shareholders and their own priorities and preferences. They are utterly critical to the Americans. They are utterly critical to the Chinese, mainland China. David, what do you think, what are they going to do going forward? How do they manage their equities in this environment, in your view?
Well, I think the smart thing for them to do is to diversify off of Taiwan, right? I mean, you just don't want to have that many of your assets in one place any more than you would put that big a part of your portfolio in one stock or one region of the world, right? You'd want to be diversified. The difficulty is that they don't necessarily have the talent around the world to be able to keep being able to do what they do so well on the island in Taiwan. And that's going to take a long time to build up. It took a long time to create this problem. Ian, it's going to take a long time to solve this problem. And the difficulty is we don't have a long time on this, that the time frame that China has declared about which at the moment at which they might be ready to take over in Taiwan, or at least attempt to, is more like 2027. There's no way in the next 5 years we're going to diversify that much.
But when you say diversify, I mean, I want to get from TSMC's perspective, are you talking about they need to diversify from their perspective? They need to diversify so they have major production facilities in the United States and in China, in addition to other places?
Well,
or are you not suggesting that?
They need them in the United States. They probably need them in Europe, which is where these ASML devices, as they're called, these high-end manufacturing devices are produced. They may well want to have some capacity in China, but their concern about that is that China would use the moment to steal the technology. Frequently, when companies go into China, the price for getting in is sharing the technology. So it's going to be a very tricky set of moves for Taiwan Semiconductor. And for the Taiwan government, they may well conclude that if they're doing a porcupine strategy, keeping China at bay, that the biggest part of the porcupine is actually Taiwan Semiconductor, that China cannot afford to bomb that building, but China also can't afford to do something that would make the talent that's inside that facility flee to the United States or elsewhere.
So before we close, let me turn back to the United States. You and I were talking before the shoot on the documentary that you've recently done about domestic U.S. national security challenges too. And I'm wondering, as we look forward to the midterm elections, as we see the violence, the attempted assassination of Nancy Pelosi that led to the hospitalization of her husband, Paul. I mean, so many things that feel unprecedented inside the United States. Talk about, just for a couple of moments, where you see the great vulnerabilities in domestic violence and instability in the context of U.S. national security.
So it's a fascinating question because our greatest national security threat right now is really an insider threat to a great degree. You know, it's remarkable, Ian, if you and I were sitting around in late 2016, as we began to understand the scope of the Russian interference in the 2016 election, and we said, where do we think this will be in 6 years? I think what we would have said is greater Russian interference, more Chinese interference, and we are seeing China try to figure out a little bit about our election system and disinformation, maybe more from Iran or North Korea. But I don't think, Ian, that we would have thought that the number one threat to the stability of our election system was going to be Americans who were trying to put in place the vote counters so that they could assure a victory for their favorite candidate or attempt to assure that. And that really is the number one problem. And it's backed up by a new acceptance that if you don't like the outcome of an election, violence is then in some way warranted. We haven't seen that in this country in 125, 150 years, except for, at sporadic moments. And that's the big concern that comes out of the polling numbers that show that there's still a substantial minority of Americans who believe that Joe Biden was not legitimately elected president. And that's pretty remarkable. You would have thought that over time that would have dissipated, and instead it's held quite steady.
Sober analysis. My friend, David Sanger, really appreciate you joining today.
Thank you, Ian. Great to be with you.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World podcast. Like what you've heard? Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from Visa. The pandemic has dealt the world an almost generational setback in ending global inequality. But there are ways for technology to help get things back on track. Visa and GZERO Media have partnered to explore the ways in which digital tools can help close the global equality gap. Visit gzeromedia.com/closing the gap to learn about the crucial role remittances, digital trade, and the shift away from cash payments can play in empowering underserved groups to participate in the global economy.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.